The American doctor holds the X-ray film up to the light box and the room goes silent. Carl stands there in the examination room, shirtless, trying to control his breathing after the technician told him to inhale as deeply as possible. The doctor points to a dark shadow on the left side of the film, irregular and spreading like spilled ink, and then he says 3 words through the translator. "You have tuberculosis." Carl does not understand what that means at first, because he came here complaining about a cough, not expecting a death sentence. But the look on the doctor's face tells him everything he needs to know. We are in the early months of 1944, and Carl is a German prisoner of war being held in a camp somewhere in the American Midwest. Now we go back 6 months to understand how the cough began, and why no one noticed it was killing him. Carl was captured in North Africa in the spring of 1943 after his unit was cut off during the Allied advance. He spent weeks in a British holding camp in Tunisia, then was loaded onto a transport ship bound for the United States. The ship's hold was packed with hundreds of German and Italian prisoners, sleeping in stacked bunks with almost no ventilation. Men coughed constantly down there, and the air smelled like sweat, diesel fuel, and sickness. Carl developed his cough during the crossing, but so did dozens of other men. It started as a tickle in his throat, the kind you get from breathing stale air and sleeping in damp clothes. By the time the ship docked in New York, Carl was coughing every morning, but he assumed it would fade once he got out of that hold. It did not. After processing through a military detention facility, Carl was sent by train to a prisoner of war camp in the interior of the country, a sprawling compound surrounded by wire and watchtowers. The camp held more than 2,000 German prisoners, most of them from the Afrika Korps and a few from the Italian campaign. The barracks were long wooden buildings with rows of bunk beds, a coal stove at each end, and windows that leaked cold air in the winter. Carl was assigned to a bunk near the door, which meant he felt every draft and every gust when someone came in from outside. The cough persisted through the fall and into the winter, getting worse as the temperature dropped. Carl told himself it was normal that everyone coughed in winter, that it would pass when spring came. But deep down, he knew something was different about this cough. It came from lower in his chest, and sometimes when he coughed hard enough, he tasted metal in his mouth. By January, Carl was coughing up blood. Not much at first, just streaks in the phlegm that he could hide by spitting into a rag and keeping it balled up under his mattress. He did not tell anyone because showing weakness in a camp was dangerous. The other prisoners avoided sick men, not out of cruelty but out of survival instinct. If you got labeled as diseased, you became invisible. So Carl kept his cough quiet during the day and buried his face in his pillow at night when the fits became too violent to control. We are still in the prisoner of war camp in early 1944, and Carl's body is starting to betray him in ways he cannot hide. Now we see the slow collapse that happens when tuberculosis goes untreated. Carl was never a heavy man, but when he arrived at the camp, he weighed 165 pounds, solid from months of military training and field rations. By February, his uniform hangs loose on his frame, and his belt needs a new hole punched into it. His face becomes gaunt, his cheekbones sharp, and his eyes seem to sink deeper into his skull. The other prisoners notice but say nothing, because they have their own problems. The camp doctors run sick call every morning in a small building near the main gate. It is staffed by one United States Army medical officer and a couple of orderlies who speak broken German. Most of the complaints are minor: twisted ankles from work details, infected blisters, stomach bugs from spoiled food. Carl finally shows up in late February after a coughing fit during roll call left him doubled over and gasping. The doctor listens to his chest with a stethoscope and hears crackling sounds in both lungs. He writes something on a card and tells Carl through the orderly that it sounds like bronchitis or pneumonia. Rest, fluids, and report back if it gets worse. Carl takes the advice seriously for about 3 days. He stays in his bunk during free time, drinks extra water from the canteen, and tries to sleep more. But the cough does not improve, and the night sweats start. He wakes up every night soaked through his shirt and shivering, even though the barrack is warm from the coal stove. He has to wring out his undershirt over the latrine bucket and hang it to dry before morning roll call. The other men in his section start moving their bunks away from his, just a few inches at a time, until there is a noticeable gap around Carl's area. Carl's appetite disappears completely in March. The camp food is not great, but it is edible. Boiled potatoes, bread, thin soup, occasional meat. Carl forces himself to eat because he knows he is losing weight, but everything tastes like cardboard and his stomach turns at the smell of cooked fat. He starts giving his portions to other prisoners in exchange for cigarettes, even though he does not smoke. He just wants something to trade, something that makes him feel like he still has value. By the end of March, Carl weighs 135 pounds, and his ribs are visible through his shirt. The coughing fits become more frequent and more violent. Sometimes Carl coughs so hard he vomits, and sometimes he coughs until he blacks out for a few seconds. One morning during roll call, he coughs up a clot of blood the size of a coin and has to spit it into the dirt at his feet. The guard sees it and marks something on his clipboard. 2 days later, Carl is told to report to the camp administration building with his personal belongings. He assumes he is being punished, or transferred, or maybe sent to solitary for being disruptive. He does not realize that the guard's report has triggered a medical protocol that might save his life. We are now in early April of 1944, and Carl is being moved out of the main camp. Now we see the machinery of the prisoner of war medical system, and how one coughing man becomes a case file. Carl is loaded into the back of a military truck, along with 3 other sick prisoners. None of them know where they are going, and the guards do not explain. The truck drives for 2 hours through flat farmland and small towns, and Carl watches the landscape pass through the canvas flap at the back. He feels a strange mix of relief and fear, because leaving the camp means something serious is happening, but he does not know if that is good or bad. The truck pulls up to a large military installation with multiple buildings, a flagpole, and a real hospital wing. This is not a camp. It is a medical facility run by the United States Army for treating prisoners of war with serious illnesses. Carl and the other prisoners are escorted into an intake room where they are processed like new arrivals. Names, prisoner numbers, medical histories, symptoms. Carl tells the intake nurse through a translator that he has been coughing for months, losing weight, sweating at night, and coughing up blood. The nurse writes everything down without changing her expression, and Carl realizes she has heard this exact list many times before. Carl is assigned to a bed in a waiting ward and told that he will have tests done over the next few days. The ward is clean, much cleaner than the barracks, with white sheets, metal bed frames, and windows that actually open. There are about 20 other prisoners in the ward, some German, some Italian, all of them coughing. Carl lies in his bed and listens to the symphony of wet, rattling coughs echoing off the walls, and he understands for the first time that he is not unique. Whatever is wrong with him is wrong with all of them. The next morning, Carl is taken to a room he has never seen before. There is a large machine against one wall, and a technician in a white coat gestures for Carl to stand in front of it. The translator explains that this is an X-ray machine, that it will take a picture of the inside of his chest, and that Carl needs to stand very still and hold his breath when told. Carl has heard of X-rays but has never experienced one. The technician positions him against a cold metal plate, adjusts his shoulders, and steps behind a screen. He tells Carl to take a deep breath and hold it. Carl inhales as deeply as he can, which is not very deep, and feels a sharp pain in his left side. The machine clicks, the technician tells him to breathe, and it is over. Carl is sent back to the waiting ward and told the doctor will see him when the results are ready. He waits for 3 hours, watching the clock on the wall and trying not to think about what the machine might have seen inside him. When his name is finally called, he follows a nurse down a hallway to an examination room. The doctor is already there, standing in front of a light box with 2 large films clipped to it. Carl can see the outline of ribs, lungs, and something dark and wrong-looking on the left side. The doctor does not smile. He does not offer reassurance. He just points to the shadow and says the words that will change everything. We are in the examination room in April 1944, and Carl is hearing a diagnosis he does not fully understand. Now we see what it means to be told you have tuberculosis in an era before antibiotics. The doctor explains through the translator that tuberculosis is a bacterial infection that destroys lung tissue. It spreads through the air when an infected person coughs, which is why it thrives in crowded places like ships, barracks, and prisons. The dark areas on Carl's X-ray are cavities, places where the infection has eaten through the lung and left holes. The doctor estimates that Carl has been infected for at least 6 months, possibly longer, and that without treatment he will continue to deteriorate. Carl asks the question that every patient asks, "Am I going to die?" The doctor pauses, weighs his words carefully, and says that tuberculosis can be fatal, but that many patients survive with proper rest, nutrition, and isolation. The word isolation hits Carl harder than the diagnosis itself. He asks what that means, and the translator explains that he will be moved to a special ward for tuberculosis patients, separated from the general population, and kept there until his condition stabilizes. No work details, no recreation yard, no contact with healthy prisoners. Carl feels a wave of panic, because isolation sounds like being erased. Within an hour, Carl is transferred to the tuberculosis ward on the far side of the hospital complex. It is a separate building with its own entrance, its own staff, and its own rules. The ward holds about 30 patients, all men, all coughing, all trapped in the same slow battle. Carl is assigned a bed near a window, given a set of hospital clothes, and handed a metal cup and plate stamped with his prisoner number. The nurse explains that his dishes will not be shared with anyone else, that he must cover his mouth when he coughs, and that he will be weighed and examined every week. Carl nods, but he is barely listening. He is watching the other men in the ward, trying to figure out who is getting better and who is dying. Let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. Are you in the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, or somewhere else? We would love to know who is keeping these stories alive, because tuberculosis in prisoner of war camps was one of the silent killers of World War II, and most people today have no idea how many men wasted away in isolation wards just like this one. The treatment in 1944 is shockingly simple: rest, food, and fresh air. There are no antibiotics yet, no drugs that can kill the bacteria inside Carl's lungs. The only strategy is to strengthen his body enough that his immune system can fight the infection on its own. Carl is put on bed rest, which means he is not allowed to walk more than a few steps without permission. He is given extra rations: milk, eggs, butter, meat, foods that are almost never seen in the regular prisoner of war diet. The logic is that tuberculosis feeds on malnourished bodies, so the hospital tries to reverse the weight loss. Every afternoon, weather permitting, the patients are taken outside to sit in the sun. The theory is that sunlight and fresh air help the lungs heal, though no one can explain exactly why. We are now in the late spring of 1944, and Carl has been in the isolation ward for 6 weeks. Now we see what daily life looks like when survival depends on patience and luck. Carl's days follow a rigid routine: wake at 6, breakfast in bed, morning examination by the nurse, rest, lunch, afternoon sun time, rest, dinner, lights out at 9. There is no work, no structured activity, nothing to do except lie in bed and think. Some men read books provided by the Red Cross, some write letters that may never be delivered, and some just stare at the ceiling and count the hours. Carl tries to read but finds that he cannot concentrate for more than a few minutes at a time. The coughing never stops in the tuberculosis ward. It is a constant background noise, day and night, wet and rattling and desperate. Some men cough so hard they break ribs, and Carl hears the sharp crack one night followed by a scream. The nurses come running, and the man is given morphine and wrapped in bandages, but the coughing does not stop. Carl learns to recognize different types of coughs, the way a sailor recognizes different types of waves. There is the dry hacking cough of early infection, the wet productive cough of active disease, and the choking suffocating cough of a man whose lungs are filling with fluid. Carl's own cough is somewhere in the middle, and he monitors it obsessively, listening for changes. Carl begins to notice patterns in who improves and who does not. The younger men tend to do better, their bodies still strong enough to fight back. The older men, especially those who were already weakened by combat or captivity, tend to slide downward no matter how much food they are given. Carl is 23, which puts him in the better category, but that does not guarantee anything. One morning he wakes to find that the man in the bed next to his has died during the night. There was no alarm, no final struggle, just silence where there used to be coughing. The nurses come in quietly, wrap the body in a sheet and wheel it out on a gurney. By lunchtime, a new patient is in that bed, and the cycle continues. Carl's weight stabilizes in May and then slowly begins to climb. The extra food is working, and his body is starting to absorb nutrients again. He gains 3 pounds in 2 weeks, then 5 more over the next month. His face fills out slightly, and the sharp angles of his collarbones become less pronounced. The doctor orders another X-ray in June, and Carl stands in front of the machine again, holding his breath and hoping for good news. When the doctor reviews the films, he allows himself a small nod. The cavities have not disappeared, but they have stopped growing, and some of the smaller lesions are beginning to calcify, which means Carl's body is walling off the infection. The doctor uses the word stable, and Carl clings to it like a life raft. We are still in the tuberculosis ward in the summer of 1944, and now we pause the personal story to understand the scale of what was happening across the entire prisoner of war system. Now we see why tuberculosis terrified camp administrators and medical officers alike. Tuberculosis was one of the leading causes of death among prisoners of war in all theaters of World War II. In German camps holding Allied prisoners, the infection rate was estimated at 15 to 20% in overcrowded facilities. In American camps holding Axis prisoners, the rate was lower but still significant, with thousands of cases documented by the end of the war. The disease spread fastest in transport ships and crowded barracks. A single infected man coughing in a closed hold could infect dozens of others during a transatlantic crossing. The incubation period for tuberculosis is long, sometimes 3 to 6 months, which meant that men who were infected during transport did not show symptoms until they were already deep in the camp system. By then, they had been sleeping, eating, and working alongside hundreds of other prisoners, all of whom had been exposed. The X-ray screening programs that identified Carl were implemented precisely because of this problem. Without early detection, one sick prisoner could trigger an outbreak that shut down an entire camp. The mortality rate for untreated tuberculosis in the 1940s was approximately 50% over 5 years. That means half of the men diagnosed would die if they received no treatment at all. With rest, nutrition, and isolation, the survival rate improved significantly, but it was still far from guaranteed. The real breakthrough would come in 1947 with the introduction of streptomycin, the first antibiotic effective against tuberculosis. But Carl does not have streptomycin. He has rest, extra food, sunlight, and hope. For thousands of prisoners of war in isolation wards across the United States, that was all they had. If you are enjoying this story and want more untold accounts from World War II prisoners of war, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We are bringing you stories that most history books never covered. Because the medical history of prisoner of war camps is a forgotten chapter of the war, overshadowed by battles and politics, but no less important to the men who lived through it. We are now in the fall of 1944, and Carl has been in the tuberculosis ward for nearly 6 months. Now we see the moment when survival stops being a hope and starts becoming a reality. Carl's weight has climbed to 150 pounds, still below his pre-illness level but high enough that he no longer looks skeletal. His cough has decreased in frequency, and the blood in his sputum has stopped appearing. He is sleeping through the night without waking up drenched in sweat, and his appetite has returned to the point where he actually looks forward to meals. The nurses notice the change and mark it in his chart. The doctor orders a third X-ray. The X-ray shows continued improvement. The cavities in Carl's lungs are still there, permanently scarred into the tissue, but they are no longer active. The infection has been contained, walled off by scar tissue and calcification. The doctor explains that Carl will never have perfect lungs again, that he will always be more susceptible to respiratory illness, and that he will need to avoid heavy physical labor for the rest of his life. But he is no longer contagious, and he is no longer dying. Carl feels a wave of emotion that he does not know how to process. Relief, gratitude, guilt for surviving when others in the ward did not. In November, Carl is transferred out of the tuberculosis ward and into a convalescent facility. It is a smaller camp, less restrictive, designed for prisoners who are recovering from serious illness and not yet ready to return to the general population. Carl is allowed to walk outside without supervision, to write letters, to receive Red Cross packages. He writes to his mother in Germany, carefully wording the letter to avoid mentioning the tuberculosis because he does not want her to worry. He says he has been in a hospital for a minor illness and is now feeling much better. He does not know if the letter will reach her, but the act of writing it feels important. Carl remains in the convalescent facility through the winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945. He listens to war news on the camp radio and hears about the Allied advance into Germany, the collapse of the Eastern Front, and the bombing of German cities. He wonders if his hometown still exists, if his family is alive, if there will be anything left to return to. In May 1945, Germany surrenders and Carl hears the announcement in the mess hall. The other prisoners sit in stunned silence, some crying, some staring at the wall, some relieved that the killing is finally over. Carl feels all of those things at once. We are now in the post-war period, from May 1945 through early 1946, and Carl is still in the United States. Now we see what happens to prisoners of war after the fighting stops. Repatriation does not happen immediately, especially for sick or recovering prisoners. The American authorities implement a policy. No prisoner with active or recently stabilized tuberculosis will be sent back to Europe until medical officers certify that they are no longer contagious and unlikely to relapse. Carl understands the logic, but the waiting is harder than the illness was. He is no longer sick, but he is also not free. Carl is moved to yet another facility, this one designed specifically for prisoners awaiting repatriation. The camp is more relaxed than the others, with fewer guards, more recreation time, and better food. The American military is under pressure to treat German prisoners well now that the war is over, and conditions improve noticeably. Carl spends his time reading, playing cards, and attending English language classes taught by a volunteer teacher. He learns basic phrases and wonders if he will ever use them again. He also gains more weight, reaching 160 pounds by the fall, almost back to his pre-tuberculosis level. In December 1945, Carl undergoes a final medical examination and chest X-ray. The results are reviewed by a panel of doctors who determine that his tuberculosis is fully inactive and that he is medically cleared for repatriation. Carl receives his discharge paperwork in January 1946, nearly 3 years after he was captured in North Africa. He is loaded onto a train with hundreds of other German prisoners, transported to a port on the East Coast, and put on a Liberty ship bound for Europe. The crossing takes 2 weeks, and Carl spends most of it on deck, breathing the cold sea air and watching the horizon. The ship docks in Le Havre, France, and the prisoners are processed through a British-run repatriation center. Carl is interviewed by Allied officers who ask about his political affiliations, his military service, and any war crimes he may have witnessed or committed. Carl answers honestly, and his record is clean. He is given a set of civilian clothes, a small amount of money, and a travel permit to return to the American occupation zone in Germany. He boards a train heading east, sitting in a crowded compartment with other former prisoners, all of them silent, all of them wondering what they will find when they get home. We are now in February 1946, and Carl is back in Germany for the first time in almost 4 years. Now we see what homecoming looks like when the country you left no longer exists. Carl's hometown is in the American occupation zone, a small city in southern Germany that was heavily bombed in the final months of the war. When Carl steps off the train, he barely recognizes the place. Entire blocks have been reduced to rubble, and the streets are filled with refugees, displaced persons, and former soldiers trying to find their families. Carl walks through the ruins carrying a small duffel bag with everything he owns. His family's house is still standing, but it has been damaged by shrapnel and fire. The windows are boarded up, and the front door is marked with occupation authority notices. Carl knocks, and his mother opens the door. She does not recognize him at first, because he left as a boy and came back as a man, thinner, older, marked by illness and captivity. When she realizes it is him, she pulls him inside and holds him without speaking. Carl learns that his father was killed in an air raid in 1944, that his younger brother is missing and presumed dead on the Eastern Front, and that his sister survived but has moved to another city to find work. Carl tries to rebuild his life in a country that has no jobs, no infrastructure, and no clear future. He finds work in a rebuilding crew, clearing rubble and salvaging bricks, but the labor is hard on his damaged lungs. After a few weeks, he develops a persistent cough and has to quit. He finds lighter work in a warehouse, sorting supplies for the occupation authorities, and that becomes his life for the next several years. He marries in 1949, has children in the 1950s, and never speaks about the tuberculosis except when doctors ask about his medical history. The cough never fully leaves him. In cold weather it comes back, dry and hacking, a reminder of the disease that almost killed him. In his 60s, Carl develops chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a consequence of the scarring in his lungs. He lives until 1983, dying at the age of 62 from respiratory failure. His death certificate lists the immediate cause as pneumonia, but his medical records tell the full story. The tuberculosis he contracted in a transport ship in 1943, diagnosed by an X-ray in 1944, and treated in an American hospital ward, left scars that weakened him for the rest of his life. Carl's story is not unique. Thousands of German and Italian prisoners of war in American camps were diagnosed with tuberculosis, treated in isolation wards, and sent home with damaged lungs. Most of them never spoke publicly about their experiences, because illness and captivity were not stories that post-war Germany wanted to hear. But the medical records remain, archived in military hospitals and research institutions, documenting a silent epidemic that killed and maimed as surely as any battlefield.